It's 1517. A German monk posts what is probably the most important internet rant slash inner office memo in history, the 95 Theses. You would assume that with 95 separate points that they would be too long for anyone to read, but read they did. Must not have been a very competitive reading market. Any hoodles, he hopes to basically start a conversation with the church and hopefully reform it. He ends up starting a revolution that changes everything. I know that historians tend to be hyperbolic, and we always say that everything changes, and everything naturally changes anyway. But no, this is really one of those moments where everything in Europe and increasingly the New World changes because of the Protestant Reformation. Now, he gets a revolution. What he doesn't expect is a world war. More on that world war in a minute, but for right now, let's focus on the fact that Protestantism has completely upended the very idea of Europe. Because to a certain extent, what we consider to be Europe is, well, started by this idea of Christendom, a Europe that is united under the auspices of the Catholic Church. Well, that unity is now broken. Heck, that unity is broken in, the Holy Roman Empire, this sort of Catholics only club. Uh, yeah, the Holy Roman Empire, if you remember, consists of lots of Germany, Belgium, northern Italy, Austria, Czechoslovakia. Like, it was scattered all over. But the reason it was holy is because it was connected to the Catholic Church and ruled by an elected emperor. Well, now a huge chunk of these Holy Roman imperial states, specifically in northern Germany and areas like Saxony and Brandenburg, they're no longer Catholic, they're Protestant, which is a problem. One thing to kind of remember here is that Germany is going to be the center of a lot of the Protestant Reformation, but Germany itself is not a state. In other words, Germany doesn't have a government. It's divided into tons of smaller states. So, for example, you don't have Germany, but you have Brandenburg, you have Saxony, you have Bavaria, you have all of these small sort of principalities. Some of them are ruled by princes or archbishops or dukes or what have you. So, in other words, Germany isn't as unified as what you're going to see in France or England or Spain or these other sort of more powerful nation states. So, just a little bit of context. So, the first of the religious wars are kind of very vicious civil wars. In Germany, you have this really horrific conflict called the Peasants' War. In France, you have a series of religious conflicts that are eventually ended with the publication of the Edict of Nantes. That is spelled Nantes, which grants freedom of religious expression to Protestants. Even though England was Protestant, it has moments where it almost reverts back to Catholicism and will continue to sort of hang on the precipice between Anglicanism and Protestantism for over 100 years. By far, the biggest of all the religious wars is the 30 Years' War, which isn't false advertising. It actually does span 30 years. Some wars, like the 100 Years' War, actually last for longer than 100 years. The 7 Years' War actually lasts 9 years. So, fortunately, we have a war in which, at the very least, the consolation prize is that it's named by people who can count. But that's about the only thing that's remotely funny about the 30 Years' War. So I said it was like a world war. It doesn't mean that it spans across the globe. It basically focuses almost entirely in Europe and really entirely within Germany. But if you think of world wars, or if your definition of world wars includes being wars that are epic in scale, where basically it's no holds barred. It's sort of a total war type situation. Then the 30 Years' War definitely qualifies. So just to give you an idea, it's estimated by historians that Germany lost about 25% of its total population. Some parts of Germany were almost entirely depopulated. In comparison, the country that, or one of the countries that gets hit the hardest by the Second World War was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in contrast, loses 12% of its population. So, in other words, if you're looking at total war and carnage, then the 30 Years' War is almost as, or in some cases, is worse than World War II. And that's saying something because this carnage is accomplished by armies with 17th century technology. I mean, you saw sort of the teaser I put in the very beginning of the video that shows that the most devastating weapons of the time were like muskets that can't really hit anything, cannons, and pikes. And that's basically it. And yet, so many people, Protestants and Catholics, both die. It begins more or less as a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire wants to basically force all of the German states to adopt Protestantism, and a number of Protestant states reject that. Most notably, Denmark actually joins the war, and then Sweden does. This is, if there are any what we call Sweaboos, people who are fans of Sweden, this is kind of Sweden's moment to shine, because Sweden has a modern, well-trained army under a warrior king, Gustavus Adolphus II, also called the Lion of the North, and he lands his army and reverses a series of Protestant defeats, and it looks like the Protestants are, doing okay for a time. Then what happens is there's the Battle of Lutzen, where Gustavus Adolphus basically gets cannonballed to death. Usually those two things go together, being cannonballed and, dying. So at that point, the situation kind of reaches this rough stalemate. Then the plot thickens, because the big powers that have been sort of staying in the background in this conflict are England and France. Spain, by the way, is fighting a protracted war of its own, and it's sort of on the side of the Holy Roman Empire, mostly because the Spanish are also ruled by the Habsburgs. That's a whole other story. But England and France are basically fighting, are waiting in the background. Now, England's got a lot on its plate, because during this time period, England is fighting a civil war of its own. We'll talk about that in a little more depth later. The English Civil War, a war between the king and parliament, but even though it's a political war, there are some significant religious overtones. The more interesting situation is France. France is actually ruled by a Catholic cardinal by the name of Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu is basically France's prime minister. The French have a king, Louis XIII de Bourbon, but Cardinal Richelieu basically runs everything. He's very intelligent, very clever, and I'll let you take a guess as to which side he joins in the conflict. Okay, time's up. If your bingo card said Protestantism, then you'd be right. Yeah, France actually joins the Protestant powers. Why? Well, for France, this isn't a religious war. This is a war to advance its own state interest. Even though France and the Holy Roman Empire share a common religion, they don't share common state interest. France views the Holy Roman Empire as a competitor. And so Richelieu joins the Protestants for what he calls raison d'etat, which means reasons of state. Has nothing to do with religion and everything to do with advancing the power and position of France. We're going to see, by the way, that France again and again is willing to make strange alliances without consideration of religion whatsoever. So France first allies itself to the Protestant Swedes, then eventually, spoiler, it's going to ally itself with the Ottoman Empire, which, hopefully this isn't that much of a bombshell, is mostly Muslim. The war ends with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Spoiler, the Holy Roman Empire doesn't force the German states to convert to Catholicism again. Instead, what happens is that there's a principle that each of the German states can basically choose their own religion. And so what basically happens is that the northern German states generally become Protestant, except for you, Saxony. The southern German states generally remain Catholic. And if you look at Germany today, that is still pretty much the case. But it's significant beyond German religious history. The Treaty of Westphalia is the bedrock of our international system today. Our international system today is often called the Westphalian state system. What is the Westphalian state system? Well, it's basically this idea that all states are equally sovereign. So, in other words, if you're looking at legal standing in the world, France and England are legally equal. So too are France and, for example, we'll say Denmark. Denmark is a much smaller country, and yet, at least on the international stage, there's some legal equality there. And this, extends all the way to the United Nations today. So the Treaty of Westphalia is a pretty big deal. It also is the beginning of this idea that nation states, in other words, governments that span a certain bounded territory, that have a people who have something in common with one another, that is going to be the way to go in the future. So after the 30 Years' War, we enter this period called the Age of Absolutism. It's called the Age of Absolutism because we see the emergence of powerful state monarchs who really rule without any significant check on their authority. And that includes without checks on their authority coming from the nobility, from the church. One of the things that the Protestant Reformation does is it means that it weakens the church to such an extent that secular rulers are less reluctant to outright defy the church. But there's another reason why you see the emergence of absolutist governments. War tends to concentrate power in the hands of the executive, whether that executive is a democratically elected president or a king, queen, emperor, empress, so on of a state. So we've seen the emergence of very powerful monarchies, and one reason for that is because of the carnage of the 30 Years' War itself. Remember that war is universally terrible, but wars aren't equally terrible. The 30 Years' War is one of those wars that is absolutely horrific. So, just to give you guys an idea, roughly 8 million civilians were killed in the war. And by the end of it, even though both sides were fighting for God, by the end of it, Protestants and Catholics were fighting other Protestants and Catholics, bizarrely enough. The religious mission of the war was sort of lost sight of, and the war just reverted to absolute chaos and carnage. And so it's around this time period that the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes writes the book The Leviathan. You'll see his name a little bit later. But if you absolutely want to know, the name Thomas, Thomas, and then space Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes writes the work called The Leviathan. And his argument is that you have to have strong monarchs, not necessarily because these monarchs are chosen by God, though that's what a lot of these monarchs will claim, but because human beings are terrible. And to be honest, if you're looking at the 30 Years' War, you don't have a shortage of examples to point to that argue that human beings are terrible. In the siege of Magdeburg, the forces that took the city basically slaughtered all of the inhabitants. Was it against the laws of war and generally accepted norms of the era? Yeah. Did it happen anyway? Also, yeah. So many people like Hobbes are looking at what happened and going, well, you know what? People are basically just savage. Unless you have a strong authority that curtails their worst ambitions, then what's going to happen is that we're all just going to slaughter each other. And I'm going to sort of paraphrase here what Hobbes says: without the Leviathan, without a strong absolute monarch or leader, life will be nasty, brutish, and short. So the recipe to have a less nasty, less brutish, and longer life is to appoint an absolute monarch. So let's roll that absolute monarchy footage. First contestant, we have the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were one chromosomed wonders originally from Switzerland in the 1200s, and basically what happens is that the rule in the Holy Roman Empire is you can elect anybody Holy Roman Emperor as long as they're Habsburgs. The Habsburgs, except for a few very specific exceptions, always get elected Holy Roman Emperor, which means that already makes them some of the most powerful people in Europe. But I've frequently mentioned Charles V as being incredibly powerful. This is because when he was Holy Roman Emperor, he ruled Spain, southern Italy, Austria, Bohemia, today Czechoslovakia, all of Germany, parts of modern-day Belgium. And by the way, the Habsburgs acquire almost all of their territory through marriage. In other words, what takes Napoleon and Charlemagne good old-fashioned conquest, the Habsburgs are able to grab through very clever and politically astute marriages. The Habsburgs were very cosmopolitan, partially because you had Habsburg rulers from all over Europe. There were Spanish Habsburgs, there were Austrian Habsburgs, and to be honest, their nation of origin didn't really matter. What mattered was their family lineage. Charles V actually has sort of a quote that illustrates how cosmopolitan the Habsburgs were. I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse. That poor horse. But if you want insight into the ultimate objective of the Habsburg family, you can find it on their coat of arms, which has the following letters: A-E-I-O-U. That's not the Habsburgs trying to educate you on the vowels in the Roman alphabet. What the Habsburgs basically did there is they put in an acronym. AEIOU stands for Austria est imperare orbi universo, or it is Austria's destiny to rule the world. So this is a family with some pretty significant ambitions. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that the Habsburg emperors also controlled almost all of the New World? So Charles spends most of his reign trying to fight the Ottoman Empire and other Protestants. But ultimately, he couldn't keep his holdings together. When he dies, the empire basically fragments so that there are Habsburgs in Austria and Habsburgs in Spain. Ultimately, the Austrian Habsburgs last for a very long time, and there's an Austrian emperor in Austria, a Habsburg emperor in Austria, until the end of World War I. Okay, so we're going to also compare absolutism versus constitutionalism in a little bit. So I'll let you kind of take a look at this chart, and you can ask me any questions that you want. So one thing, let's go ahead and define what homogeneous or homogeneous means. Homogeneous populations means that this is a population that shares a lot of traits in common. So a population with a common culture, common religion, that kind of thing. So the other significant absolute monarch during this time period is King Louis XIV. Now, that might be a little confusing if you've been paying attention, because we just said that France was generally ruled by Cardinal Richelieu. Like, the monarch was powerful, but the monarch doesn't really play a direct role in ruling. He basically delegates that to Cardinal Richelieu. By this point, Cardinal Richelieu has gone on to meet his great reward, but he's succeeded by another cardinal, Cardinal Mazarin. So at this point, Louis XIV comes to power and says that it is his time and that he shall rule personally. So Louis XIV is known as being incredibly fashionable. Look at that wig. It looks like, Queen during their, long curly hair era. But Louis XIV is also known for Versailles, for being ostentatious, etc. I'm going to give you the other side to Louis XIV. So everything you need to know about Louis XIV, I think, comes from the Fronde. The Fronde were a series of civil wars waged between France's nobility and the state. So Louis's earliest memories revolve around him being dragged from his bed when he was a child, and basically being treated as a captive. So what he learns from this is that absolute power is not just something nice to have, it's also something that keeps you alive. So Louis XIV rules with the following characteristics. He rules by the grace of God. God has appointed him to be king of France. He keeps control of his nobles. More on that in just a little bit. And basically what he also tries to do is he tries to make his nobles he focuses nobles on sort of a life of pleasure instead of focusing on the bureaucracy or the army. So the army becomes the instrument of the king, and under Louis XIV's reign, his army becomes the largest in Europe and probably the best. And Louis, kind of like the Habsburgs, has a vision of a France that expands beyond its borders. You notice that France during this time period might look a little small or puny compared to France today. Well, Louis, for better or for worse, he gonna fix that. He also utilizes his bureaucracy to help run the country, but you notice that it's not the nobility that's running things, it's not the church that's really running things, it is Louis. And this is part of a fad, because France is sort of the trendsetter, not only in fashion, but also in politics. And so you see the emergence of absolute monarchies set up in places like Prussia, Spain, and eventually Austria-Hungary. So Louis XIV has a quote that might be apocryphal. In other words, we're not sure if it actually happened, but regardless, it kind of showcases his philosophy of governance. He is supposed to have said, "L'État c'est moi," which means I am the state. So, in other words, the state isn't just about a piece of geography. It's not about a people. It is about a person. You could even say that it's about a dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty. You might remember that during the Middle Ages, the French have the Estates General, which is supposed to represent all classes, the commoners, the church, and the nobles. And the idea is that it's supposed to give approval or disapproval for taxes that are proposed by the government. Well, Louis XIV stops convening the Estates General, and basically he passes his own laws directly. We call this ruling by decree. So he sends his bureaucrats to provinces. In other words, the nobles aren't running their own provinces really anymore. He creates state-run manufacturing. By the way, Louis XIV is a big mercantilism guy under his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. So he also promotes the internal economy to improve tax revenues for wars. Louis spends most of his reign probably at war. He fights a number of very, very large ones until at the very end of his reign, his forces are they either reach a tie or they're defeated by the British and the Austrians in what we call the War of the Spanish Succession. He is supposed to have said on his deathbed, "I have loved war too much." Um, also, again, with mercantilism, he uses colonies of France, especially in the Caribbean, but also in Canada, to provide raw materials for the state. Louis XIV's rule also revolves around his palace at Versailles. So, Versailles used to be a hunting lodge, which was expanded by Louis XIV into becoming the largest private residence and palace since the age of Emperor Nero. And by the way, generally, when you're compared with Emperor Nero at all, that's not necessarily a good sign. Versailles was incredibly expensive. And I mean, just look at how posh it is. You could eat off of that floor. So, he requires all nobles and aristocrats to live here to control them. The idea is that these aristocrats and nobles are going to be so busy fighting amongst themselves for privileges and recognition that they're not going to be able to successfully unify against him. So, for example, there was competition to see who could who could become the person who officially woke the king up. Now, when it says theater state, this is an example of this because Louis probably woke up sometime between 4 and 5 in the morning, from what I understand. And at that point, he got most of the work that needed to be done. But after that, he would go back to bed. And at that point, he would be officially woken up by the courtier. And just to show you how extreme they sort of took this, as many of you know, the way that people went to the bathroom is you would put a chamber pot by your bed and you would do all your waste in there. So there was actually a bearer of the royal chamber pot that was supposed to take the chamber pot out and dump it. And supposedly whenever the bearer of the royal chamber pot walked out into the courtyard, people were supposed to bow to it. Bow to the king's poo. That being said, for all of Louis's extravagance and his lack of discipline on budgetary matters, the fact is that nobody seriously contests Louis's power, and he goes down in the history books as being Europe's longest reigning monarch, I believe, until Queen Victoria. So yeah, he has a generally successful reign, but one of the ways that Louis raised money very, very quickly for his armies and the war effort is he basically allowed nobles to make single one-time donations, which would exempt them and their descendants from tax revenue. This would be sort of like offering Elon Musk the chance to pay maybe $50 billion, and in exchange for $50 billion, he doesn't have to pay taxes at all going forward. So in the short term, France gets a lot of money because of this. But in the long term, what happens is that France loses its most important tax base. And what does that directly connect to? Well, a revolution in 1789 that we'll talk about much later. Now, the British system of government uses a parliamentary monarchy. And this is a situation where the king awkwardly shares power between a parliament that represents the nobility, that's called the House of Lords, and the upper urban class called the House of Commons. Now, it's been an open question who has more power, Parliament or the monarchy. But safe money was to bet on the monarchy for the most part. Now, the other thing that you should probably take note of is in the House of Commons itself. You know how we talked about the Calvinists being very entrepreneurial? So the upper urban class tends to be inspired by Calvinism. They're what we call the Puritans. They want to purify the Anglican Church of Catholic influences and adopt more Calvinist religious teachings. The king and a lot of the nobility are traditional Anglicans, which means that they don't really have many differences between the Anglican Church under their tenure doesn't have a lot of differences between, with the Catholic Church. They're very, very similar to one another. Now, I'm going to compress a lot of really interesting history. I'm sorry, by the way, if you find the Barons' Wars to be the most fascinating thing ever. But the English Civil War emerges because the king basically ignores Parliament, and Parliament has only one job, really. Parliament's job is to give assent or to decline tax rises. Basically, Parliament was not in session. The king decided to pass a tax anyway over the heads of Parliament, and as a consequence, this leads to the English Civil War. So this is a horrific civil conflict. All civil wars generally are horrific. England loses about 5% of its total population. So at the end of the conflict, King Charles I is captured, and he is executed by the state, by Parliament. Now, the problem is that Parliament doesn't have enough legitimacy or authority to practically rule over the country. So even though England is technically a republic from 1649 to 1660, in practice, it's a military dictatorship ruled by a Puritan by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And by the way, if you want to get a sense for Oliver Cromwell's popularity, take note that one of the things that gets outlawed during the military dictatorship is, among other things, playing cards and Christmas. Yeah, a real war on Christmas. Now, eventually, the Puritans are so stuffy and so boring that when Oliver Cromwell dies, he is succeeded by his weeby son Richard, and pretty much everybody tells him that they're done with this whole military dictatorship thing. And Richard, for his part, says, "You're right," and he basically resigns, abdicates. He has the rank of Lord Protector, so I'm not really sure what that means. But in practice, Oliver Cromwell and his son Richard, at least for a short time, were more powerful than any king of England would have hoped to be. At this point, King Charles I, traumatized son, Charles II, is invited to rule England. The problem is that Charles II doesn't have an heir of his own. So Charles II dies, and he dies childless. The throne passes to his brother, James II. The problem is that James II is Catholic, and I'm going to shortcut some significant history here, and suffice to say that the British Parliament and a substantial chunk of the military actually decides to overthrow King James II. They invite his daughter, the Protestant Queen Mary, and her husband William of Orange to jointly rule England. But before they do that, they have to sign the Bill of Rights. And this is called the Glorious Revolution of 1689. The short version is that now going forward, Parliament is the dominant political institution in Great Britain, not the monarchy. And we'll also talk about how that relationship, or how Parliament continues to slowly but surely chip away at the power of the monarchy going forward. Till next time.